I'm excited to begin these sessions with a special discussion with Jack Jones, the Chairman Emeritus of the FAIR Institute, author of the FAIR Model, author of FAIRCAM, and we're going to be discussing the history of the FAIR Model and the future of CRQ as well. He's going to be in discussion with Todd Tucker, the Managing Director of the FAIR Institute. Reminder to please use the QR code on your program to submit questions virtually throughout the session. So with that, I'm going to invite Todd and Jack up to the stage.
Hey, do I need to do anything for the question?
Fresh to get the questions. I got it.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am getting to know Jack, as probably many of you are as well if you're new to FAIR. Some of you may know Jack quite well. Let me see a show of hands. How many of you know Jack already? Then why are you in here? No. Show of support, right?
For punishment.
Gluttons. Okay, there we go. So Jack and I spent a little time last week kind of talking through, like, okay, what do we want to kind of focus on here? But I think one of the things we want to do is for the folks that are new to FAIR and you know may not know Jack obviously, is to start with a little bit of the story of how and why and all of that, because I think it's still 100% applicable to today. So we're going to do that. But the question I'm going to start with, Jack, is not why did you create FAIR, but why did Jack Jones create FAIR?
Why was it a fit for me?
Yeah.
So it seems to me that I'm wired, just naturally wired, and maybe it's just being uncomfortable with uncertainty. I think that's probably part of it. But in everything I've done professionally, I've really needed to understand how whatever it is I'm working on works, right? So when I was first in technology and doing system admin work and that sort of thing, and having to do programming of one sort or another, my programming language of choice was assembly language, because you're right there operating at the lowest level of abstraction in the technology, and you had to know exactly what was going on and how it worked, otherwise your program didn't work. And that was just a more comfortable place for me. So I was, I operated at that level of depth, if you will, in my responsibilities there. And then when I got into security and I got into attack and penetration and that sort of work, again, the deeper I could operate at in terms of like, my hobby was disassembling viruses, right?
Yeah.
So, trying to learn what was going on at that level. So I think that's why. And when I got into sort of the risk dimension of our problem space, I got slapped upside the head, where it was obvious I didn't know anything about risk, and that was just completely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I had to figure it out.
And I know we're going to talk about like why did you create it when you were at Nationwide, like what led to that, and maybe this is kind of getting there. It's what was that uncomfort? What was that discomfort caused by? Was it simply intellectual curiosity, or was it more of a fact of like how you explained it to the business?
I viewed it as a sort of a career-limiting disability.
Okay.
So, I mean, the executives at an insurance company, the business executives, they think in terms of risk. And when I was bringing security-related problems to them, and I couldn't explain it in terms that they understood or cared about, I could see the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
I was not going to fare well.
Yeah. No pun intended, right?
No pun intended.
Okay, so now let's go back and just the story at Nationwide and why create it. What were you faced with at that time?
Yeah. Well, I was the new CISO there. And as a new CISO, of course, one of the first things you have to do is put together a strategy that's going to fix all of the problems, the security problems of the organization. And so I put together my strategy, and I went on my dog and pony show to the executives I remember sitting across from the CIO of the Shared Services Organization, right? They provided IT for the entire enterprise. And I made my pitch. Here's my strategy. Here's all the wonderful things we can do. And oh, by the way, here's the price tag associated with that. And he listened to my spiel and he said, so tell me, Jack, how much risk do we have? And I said, well, lots. You know, I mean, I was prepared to talk about threats and vulnerabilities. He's asking me how much risk? Lots. And he said, if I spend these millions of dollars you're asking for, how much less risk will I have? And I was like, less. And he knew he wasn't going to get a better answer. It was a teaching moment. He was telling me, you know, that unless you can speak in these terms, you're just really expensive noise. And he said, I can spend this money a lot of different ways. And all these other ways I can spend the money, I have some sense of what I'm getting for it. And I couldn't answer those questions. And it seemed like such an obvious and important question that I should be able to answer. And I was embarrassed and really uncomfortable. And again, from a tenure perspective, I was, uncomfortable. And so I resolved to try to figure out how to answer those questions. And I went back and I spent a number of months researching all the different risk assessment methods in the industry, most of which fundamentally haven't changed in the 20 plus years since. And none of them allowed me to answer those questions in any sort of way that would be meaningful to them. So, being the curious sort, I like problems to solve.
Yeah.
I dug in and started trying to figure it out. And the very first thing I did, because he used this word risk and in a way that I hadn't been using the word, right? I talked about risks, this password's a risk, the usual thing. And so I looked in the dictionary, looked up the word risk, and of course, like many words, there are different definitions, but the definition that seemed to fit what he was talking about, what he cared about, was exposure to loss, which makes sense. And I said, okay, that's my starting point. Risk is exposure. I'm going to interpret that as the probability of an event or loss of infrequency, and loss magnitude, And that was my starting point. I just decomposed it from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things you said the other day that was interesting is you read all these books and you intentionally stayed away from cybersecurity or security ones.
So for the first year of real development on FAIR, I read like 44 different books, and not a single one was information security. It was like, it ranged from probability and physics and decision making and psychology and these sorts of things, because it became really clear to me that the more I got into the problem I was trying to solve, the more it seemed to me that virtually all of the works in our profession, while they might be great at certain dimensions of what we have to deal with, when it came to risk, they were not only not helpful, they were actually problematic, because I felt like trying to decompose this problem of risk was like trying to untangle a really unruly knot. You pull at some thread, you're thinking you're making progress, and you realize you just made a knot tighter in this bundle of knots. You have to back out and figure out where you went wrong. And most of the knots that I had to deal with in trying to untangle this mess were things that I'd learned and been taught over the decade plus I'd been in the field, right? Just misperceptions and incorrect assumptions and frankly, bad practices. And when I looked, in the early days, when I was still allowing myself to read works from our profession, I would sometimes take something I learned from that and try to apply it in this problem I'm trying to solve, and it would just create more knots.
Yeah.
So I forbade myself from reading anything in our profession for over a year, actually.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you something we didn't talk about, but you mentioned, kind of like almost being embarrassed and not being able to answer the question. And I've heard that from others, that or in our community. I think Chris Porter has a similar conversation or a story to tell. Mark definitely does, Tamalo. And then you hear of a lot of folks that haven't had that. And I wonder if you're a CISO and you haven't had that, ask you to speculate, like why is that? And maybe what should they be doing differently that gets them to that level?
They may not be asked those questions.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
I think so. Before I had that fateful meeting with the CIO. When I would talk to executives, they might listen politely, or they might nod, or their eyes might roll back in their heads, or whatever the case might be. But I wouldn't tend to get probing questions. It's like, is he done yet? Unless, of course, I was creating a problem for them, in which case, they would create problems for me. But I think I was just really fortunate to be at the right place at the right time, sitting across from someone who was done with red, yellow, green.
Yeah.
And I may have just caught him on a bad day.
Yeah.
For him, great day for me.
Yeah.
Ultimately,
yeah.
not in the moment, but so that was sort of the catalyst for all that.
Yeah, it's interesting how, the right questions can lead to a whole different path. So let's switch a little bit. So after you started doing this, because I think a lot of people are starting FAIR, I've met a lot of folks here and a lot are new to FAIR and all that. So they're kind of looking at, what are some of the early benefits that you see from FAIR? So I'm curious, with your journey, what were some of the early benefits that you saw?
Yeah, there were a number, some of which I anticipated, but many I hadn't anticipated. So one was the ability to show my homework, right? So when we would do an analysis, and this played out in a number of conversations with executives where I would bring them bad news, and they would push back and ask how I came to my conclusions, my recommendations, and I would, and those were the old days, right? So before we had any technology supporting FAIR or anything like that. I mean, I hadn't even baked it into a spreadsheet yet. It was, it was a model on a whiteboard sort of thing. And so I would go up to a whiteboard and I'd diagram the FAIR ontology, and I'd walk them through the analysis. Here are the assumptions we're making, where we're getting our information, our data, and that sort of thing. And that was incredibly valuable because you can have a much richer, more meaningful conversation, and they understand that you're not just, and this is what I'm about to say was actually a description that an executive at one point had used on the security organization, said, you're a bunch of pizza-eating, beer-drinking troublemakers, right? And he meant it in the kindest way. But it was that same individual who really had that dismissive attitude towards us. I had the opportunity to have this same sort of conversation with him where I had to defend a recommendation, and I went up to the whiteboard and I diagrammed it out. And at the end of that conversation, he said, well, I guess I can't argue with that. Let's look at my options. And the coolest thing that happened out of that conversation was not that we avoided introducing a bunch of unnecessary risk to the organization through the project, his pet project. It was his attitude towards not just me, but my organization changed dramatically. He became an advocate for us rather than, someone who we were just trouble for, right?
Yeah.
So that was one. Another is conversations. So when everybody's using the same terminology in the same way, they have the same mental model about what risk is and what a loss event scenario is and those sorts of things, that can change, that can make you so much more efficient and less frustrated. How many people in here have sat across from a colleague or an auditor or regulator or some stakeholder and had essentially what feels like a religious argument about whether something is high, medium, or low risk? Has anybody lived that dream? Okay.
Nobody.
Yeah. My experience has been that the vast majority of time, the person sitting across from you is not the moron you think they are in the moment, and you're not the moron they think you are in the moment. You're using different terms to mean different things, and you just aren't aligned on what you're talking about. And I found that if you've done a really good scoping, the loss event scenario you're analyzing, so there's clarity on what's being measured, and the sort of the parameters of measurement are clearly defined and mutually understood, that those religious arguments virtually disappear. And that was a huge unexpected win.
Yeah.
My relationship with my audit colleagues at Nationwide, once I had sort of gotten FAIR to a level of maturity, if you will, that I was willing to take it outside my own organization and show others. I introduced it to our auditors, and they, once they understood what it was about, man, our conversations were so much more productive and a lot less antagonistic and that sort of thing. More fact-based and such.
Yeah.
So those are a few, a couple of the early wins.
It's interesting you're talking about a conversation with somebody, but the other story that I often hear is how it reshapes the way you as a security professional think about, say, a vulnerability. That, before I would have said this is a high-risk vulnerability, but now that you understand risk, you really put it into context that changes the nature.
And that was actually the first sort of hoped for benefit. Was one of the challenges we had at Nationwide, and this may sound familiar to some of you as well, is we had this very long sort of list of risks, right? And an unfortunate percentage of those had been characterized as high risk. And some of the problems with that are, if the organization actually was carrying that much high risk, how on earth are we still staying in business, right? That was sort of the mindset of the executives. They're like, these guys are crying wolf, because if there was truly that much high risk in here, we'd have crashed and burned.
Yeah.
And so the first project we sort of applied FAIR to was going through our risk register, if you will, and we reduced the number of high risks by an order of magnitude. And this was just using FAIR qualitatively, right? This was very rudimentary, early days, but just the clarity of scoping scenarios and understanding what a risk was and isn't, and sort of how to contextualize the things in our risk register. Man, we were able to just dramatically reduce the number of things that we characterized as high risk. And that had not only then allowed us to focus on the things that mattered most, which is a huge win, but it also began to diminish the perspective, the perception that executives had that we were just crying wolf. And we actually got to the point where, after about 9 months of applying FAIR and sort of gradually exposing the executive stakeholders to it and the benefits from it from a risk reduction, sort of a risk clarity perspective. Prior to all this, if we brought something before an executive that had been labeled high risk, that we thought nobody in their right mind would sign off on this, but they were like, yeah, whatever, they sign off and let me just get my job done, sort of thing. But after about 9 months, it was decreed that nothing with high risk would be allowed in production unless it was signed off at a very high level within the organization.
Yeah.
And that was a huge win, because finally, we felt that that they were listening.
Yep.
They took us seriously, and that we were actually having a positive effect on sort of the risk profile of the organization.
Yeah. So, we talk about a lot of this in the terms of cyber risk quantification, and you just said when we looked at it using a qualitative approach with FAIR. What is that? Describe what that's like, and do you still see that as a useful tool?
Certainly, there is such a thing as good, useful, qualitative risk measurement.
Yeah.
Almost nobody does that, but it exists, and it begins. You still have to scope what it is you're measuring, if you don't scope the thing you're supposedly measuring risk of, then the odds of it being a good measurement are not great.
Yeah.
So if you're going to use qualitative measurement, you still have to have a clearly defined scope. Then the other place where I see, not just our profession, but this is pervasive through the risk management world that I've encountered, is the ordinal scales for qualitative measurement, right? So very high through very low or whatever. The definitions are ridiculous. 95, 99 times out of 100. I saw one just yesterday. Someone sent me an email saying, we want to apply FAIR, but we want to do it qualitatively, and here's the scales. And I'm like, yeah. I made some pointed observations about the scales as they were defined, because there was such profound lack of clarity on what each level meant. I've actually taken a 5-level scale that I've seen in an organization. You have the labels, and then you have the descriptions. And I'd taken the descriptions, and I rearranged them. I left the labels where they were. I just used, moved the description. And they couldn't put it back in the right order.
Yeah.
Because the descriptions were so ambiguous. And it's like,
it's a nice
okay,
test.
That's a problem, right? But if you have clearly defined scope and you have clearly defined scales, then you can make some real progress with qualitative. There's serious limitations. You can only prioritize, with a level of precision that with the scale, right? And you can't, of course, do cost-benefit sorts of things. But the other thing to keep in mind too is, if I say you can only prioritize within sort of the precision of the scale, a natural assumption might be, well, instead of 5 level, let's do 10 levels because we have more precision then. Yeah, there is no way on God's green earth that you can get enough clear separation between, your levels with that sort of granularity.
Yeah.
Never going to happen. In fact, I've never seen a 5-level scale where the distinction between the levels is, in my view, meaningful.
Yeah.
Right? I know you can do it with 3 levels. Right? You lose precision, but you also gain clarity.
Yeah.
Right? 4, I think you can do it with. I haven't seen it with 5. It might be possible. I just haven't seen it.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about this. So some people will say, FAIR is not practical, or it's not scalable, or whatever, right? And I think they're just pointing out that anytime you have a discipline that you're trying to roll out in your organization, it's challenging for various reasons, right? But this one gets sort of lobbed a lot at FAIR. What's your perspective? First, why do you think that is the perception by some, and then how do you combat it?
Yeah, so some of that stems from sort of the baseline, right? So doing a FAIR risk measurement is always going to be, unless you have some sort of automation thing, doing a FAIR risk measurement or analysis is always going to be more time-consuming than this, right? The vast majority of risk measurements in our profession are this. There is 0 upfront cost. Anybody can do it. You don't even have to think, right? I just feel, this is medium, right? There's no upfront cost, right? And so if that's your starting point, then anything you introduce that introduces additional, time, effort, thinking is going to, for many people, feel, like, that's not acceptable. Everybody wants an easy button, and I'm no exception. When you're up to your neck in alligators, easy's a very attractive thing. But the other thing to keep in mind is something that Einstein is reputed to have said. He didn't actually say this, but he said something kind of like this. Make things as easy as possible, but as simple as possible, but no simpler, right? Because if you oversimplify, then your results are not going to be valid, right? And we work in a profoundly complicated problem space. I mean, it's insanely complicated. And to have a reasonable expectation that this works, right? That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know, and that is, again, that's most of what risk measurement is in our profession, even today. Right? As much progress as our profession is making towards better risk measurement, the vast majority of it is still that.
Yeah.
And you have plenty of people out there who you know, make these arguments, well, FAIR's too complicated, you know, or it takes too much time, or whatever the case might be, and they never offer. I have never seen an alternative offered that doesn't essentially boil down to this, right? They may package it up in words and ordinal scales that you know, sort of hide the fact that it's still this. And the simple fact is we have a very complicated problem space, and we have to make decisions. Our stakeholders have to make decisions, important decisions about this. And every decision, something to keep in mind, is every decision anybody makes, whether it's in cybersecurity or in your home life or whatever the case might be, every decision is based on a comparison between two or more options. Otherwise, it's not a decision, right? There's no fork in the road. So, and every comparison is based on some form of measurement. Now, a lot of times that measurement is sort of a instinctual gut sort of thing, right? That's how we survive as a species, right? In day to day. But when you're dealing with the kind of problems we deal with and limited resources that we have at our disposal, we have to be able to prioritize well. We have to be able to choose cost-effective solutions, and it's just entirely unrealistic to believe that we can be successful in that in our problem space if we don't admit to and account for the complexity of our problem space. And that means we have to work a little harder on our measurements. You know, and it's unfortunate, but it's just that's natural fact. And I don't think there's any other logical, rational way to think about that. Now, you know, somebody may be able to make a good argument otherwise, but I've just never heard it.
Yeah. I found with my previous life at the TBM Council that a lot of people wouldn't start the journey because they felt like, oh, we don't have good enough data, for example, or we don't have the skill sets or whatever. But then there was a whole other group of people that said, you know what, you never will unless you start, and that then you start to figure things out. Oh, you're right, we don't have the data to fill in this gap and so forth. And I think if people are thinking, well, it's just not practical or whatever, that it's because they haven't started and they haven't attacked the problem and you know, learned from it. So
and so the analogy or the example I'm going to use is I sometimes get flack for using this, but I'm going to use it anyway. So people have asked me, you know, how I would characterize sort of the maturity of our profession in this dimension, right? And where I go, and I stand by it, is, you know, we are essentially at the same level of maturity, again, by and large, as a profession in terms of understanding and measuring and managing risk, as medicine was in the 1700s, early 1800s, when bloodletting was still a thing, right? When the majority of physicians knew absolutely nothing about physiology or how the body worked or anything like that. It was just common practice, right?
Yeah.
Bloodletting had been best medical practice for over 1,000 years, despite the fact that it was killing, you know, people rather than saving people. And it wasn't due to people not caring. It wasn't due to anything other than sort of a lack of understanding. And part of where I'm going with this is when what we think of as modern medicine started to become a thing, it was not welcomed with open arms.
Yeah.
Right? There's, a large part of the medical profession wanted nothing to do with it. What do you mean there are these things you can't see that can make us sick, right? It's ridiculous, right? And so, there's this transition period from sort of one epoch of maturity, if you will, to another, and we're going through that, and it's normal and natural, and it's sometimes frustrating and difficult, but it's it's part of the journey.
Yeah, well, that's a great analogy. You mentioned automation earlier. When you kind of look at the challenge of scalability and all that, I think there's pros and cons of automation. What do you see as pros and cons?
Yeah. So first, let me say, I believe automation is critical to the future of our profession when it comes to risk measurement, simply because of the need to scale and timeliness of decision making, right? So when I was a CISO applying FAIR, we had to be really selective about where we applied it because we had limited resources and that sort of thing. And so there were decisions being made even in the organizations where I integrated FAIR. There were lots of decisions being made based on quick and dirty analyses, right? Kind of like this, but with a calibrated mental model, so I would argue a little bit better than normal, but there was simply the scale and the resource problem and timeliness problem. And so in order to have a more holistic view of our organization's risk conditions and make more fully informed decisions, we're going to have to evolve the technologies to support this to automate as much as possible. Now, it's never going to automate everything. There are always going to be, you can automate sort of the run-of-the-mill stuff, but you can't automate all the stuff we're going to encounter, right? So that's one misperception I want to put a nail in is, you will never automate all of it. But I think it's crucial for the future, but we lose some things from it too, potentially. I think there are ways to manage the downsides. One of the downsides is, and if you talk to someone who's done FAIR in the wild, for any length of time, they will tell you almost invariably that sometimes more important than the results of the analysis is the process of getting to the results, right? Yeah. So the conversations you have with stakeholders, the understanding you gain of your organization and of the risk landscape that you're managing is incredibly valuable. I can't, it's hard to imagine or adequately describe how valuable that is. And if you automate all that and you don't have those conversations, you don't have those reflections on your organization, how they work, then I think that's a loss.
Yeah.
Right? The other thing to keep in mind, how many people in here have heard of something called the Wicked Bible? Nobody, okay. So I think it was in 1631, after the printing press was developed, there was a print run of the Bible that had a typo in it. And in the 10 Commandments it said, "Thou shalt commit adultery." Oops, right? Thus the Wicked Bible name to it. Now, to be clear, hand-printed Bibles undoubtedly had typos and errors in them, right? But their effect was limited to sort of the scope of where, of the readership of that book, right? The point being that when you automate, you not only scale goodness, you can really scale badness too. Mm-hmm. And if you have an underlying model or method or data that's fundamentally flawed, and you automate that, and you base an organization's decisions off of that, that could be a very bad thing, right? And so the takeaways, I believe, from that are, I'll mention two. One is open models, open models, open models, right? I believe wholeheartedly, who in here believes proprietary encryption is a good thing? That, you know, that's been dead for decades. Everybody understands proprietary encryption is a bad idea because it can go wrong in so many ways, right? And I believe the same is true for risk quantification, automation around it, because, and in the forthcoming book, second edition of the book, I have a chapter on automating cyber risk quantification where I talk a lot about all the ways, well, not even all the ways, many of the ways that automation can go very wrong in measuring the cyber risk. And so we need to, I think, have a healthy skepticism. So I believe any automated solution should be based on an open model. The public should be able to inspect this, whatever algorithms and logic they're applying. Now I recognize that, commercial vendors are going to say, but I need to protect my intellectual property. Well, that's what patents are for, okay? So I believe very strongly in the open model concept.
Yeah. And
the other is always, always, always be skeptical. Come to the table. You're sitting down with any vendor of an automated CRQ solution, and you should start the conversation from a skeptical position, because the odds of it being done right are lower than the odds of it being done poorly, simply because of the complexity.
Yeah.
And
it's the only way they'll get better too. So.
Well, yeah, and if they're on their game, they should welcome the conversation.
Yeah.
They should be like, yeah, let's have this conversation. Absolutely.
Hey, I want to ask one more question. I know we're kind of like out, but this logged out, so I'm not going to the questions from you guys, sorry. But Jack is super available. So if you do have a question for Jack, find him. I know you will be happy to talk. Just give us some of your thoughts on where do you see this headed?
Well, I think the snowball is rolling downhill and it's gathering momentum, maybe not as fast as we would like, but it is gaining significantly. And so I believe at some point in the future, and I don't think it's that far, organizations that aren't doing this are going to be viewed as fundamentally flawed in their risk management posture. Because how else are they going to be able to defend their prioritization and their solution selection, that sort of thing, right? So I believe it will become, common practice rather than the exception. I believe also that I would like to believe that the regulators will begin to set an expectation around this, so it's sort of associated with common practice. And so if a regulator comes through the door and an organization is not doing something along these lines, they're going to be asking, why the heck not? And I also believe that security solution providers, both technology providers and process providers, will incorporate sort of how they do business and how their technologies work to support this. So if you have some cool security technology that's measuring something or analyzing something, it will, as part of its output, some part of its output will be intended to be inputs or compatible as an input with the kinds of analyses we do. Right? Currently, they're not. So when you ingest telemetry from solution providers now, the amount of interpretation and sort of data science magic that has to go on to to leverage that data in a fair analysis is a problem.
Onerous.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
So I think that will be
Yeah.
an important part of it as well.
So you all need to put pressure on your vendors to do that.
I encourage you to,
Yeah.
and I don't know if any of them are in the room now, but there are some people, like Mike Radigan. How many people in here know Mike Radigan? He's like 6'100" tall. You know, he's.
You over there?
You over there, Mike?
Is that Mike? No.
No, Mike's not here. All right.
I'm looking for a tall guy.
Yeah,
So,
look for a tall guy. Mike Radigan, great guy. He was a vendor when I was at Nationwide. He came in to sell me his stuff, right? And I asked him some questions he wasn't prepared for, you know, associated with, all right, how can he, how can he explain the value proposition of his technology in the terms that I cared about, which was fair-based?
Yeah.
And it was an uncomfortable conversation for him. And I've heard this from other vendors that in that time frame and
Yeah.
sense where I sort of put them through the same gauntlet. And I wasn't there to beat them up. I was there to try to better understand what the value proposition they had, but it also sort of gave them a different lens to see their solutions through and have a different kind of conversation with their customers and potential customers. And at least the ones that I've talked to are still willing to talk to me. They say those were they were uncomfortable, but really beneficial conversations. And I think the more often we do that, the sort of faster we can push the providers of these services and technologies to sort of join in the journey.
Well, Jack, this has been a very comfortable and beneficial conversation. So I really appreciate your time and just everything you've done. I will say this real quick is like what you've done, you've actually created a career path now for me. Yeah. This wouldn't exist and I wouldn't be here today. So I'm really grateful for it.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way now. I hope it stays that way.
I know. I'm having a blast. I really am.
Good.
So anyway, round of applause for Jack. Yeah.